Admiral Marcus Thompson stood quietly at Gate 32, his hands casually tucked into the pockets of his navy blue jacket. The airport buzzed around him. Families rushing to catch their flights, business travelers glued to their phones, and flight attendants wheeling suitcases with practiced ease. To anyone watching, Marcus looked like just another passenger waiting to board a plane. There was nothing flashy about him. No medals pinned to his chest, no uniform declaring his rank. Just a tall, confident man wearing jeans and a simple sweater, blending seamlessly into the crowd. But appearances can be deceiving. Behind that calm exterior lay decades of service to his country. As a four-star admiral in the U.S. Navy, Marcus had dedicated most of his life to protecting his nation. He'd commanded fleets across oceans, navigated tense international waters, and even played a key role in negotiating peace treaties during global crises. Yet here he was, standing in line for an ordinary commercial flight, indistinguishable from the other travelers around him. Marcus wasn't one to seek attention. Despite his accomplishments, he preferred to keep things low-key. Today, he'd chosen to dress casually, leaving his military regalia safely tucked away at home. After all, this trip wasn't official duty. It was personal. He was heading back to see his family after attending a high-profile defense summit overseas. For once, he wanted to feel like a regular person, not someone constantly recognized for his rank or achievements. Still, something felt off as he waited. Every now and then, he noticed people glancing at him. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but the looks grew more frequent. Some were curious, others dismissive, and a few seemed almost judgmental. One woman nearby whispered to her companion, pointing subtly in his direction. Marcus pretended not to notice, brushing it aside. Maybe they mistook him for someone else, or maybe it was something else entirely. As the minutes ticked by, Marcus found himself reflecting on how often moments like these occurred. Over the years, he'd grown accustomed to being underestimated because of his race. Whether it was walking into a meeting room full of skeptical faces or trying to book a table at an upscale restaurant, there were always reminders that some people couldn't or wouldn't see past the color of his skin. It didn't bother him as much anymore. Instead, he used those experiences to fuel his determination to break barriers silently, without fanfare. When the gate agent finally called for boarding, Marcus stepped forward with the rest of the passengers. His mind briefly wandered to what awaited him at home: a warm meal, laughter with his kids, and perhaps a long overdue nap. Little did he know, this flight would turn out to be anything but routine. Somewhere between takeoff and landing, his quiet journey would transform into a story that would leave everyone talking and questioning their own assumptions about the world around them. For now, though, Marcus simply adjusted his carry-on bag over his shoulder and joined the line, ready to face whatever came next with the same resilience and grace that had carried him through every challenge before. As Admiral Marcus Thompson approached the gate agent's desk, he felt a familiar sense of routine. He had flown countless times before, often upgrading to first class using the frequent flyer miles he'd accumulated over years of travel for military duties. It was nothing extravagant, just a small perk that made long flights more comfortable after grueling work trips. This time, however, things didn't go as smoothly as they usually did. The gate agent, a young woman with a headset clipped to her ear, glanced up briefly as Marcus stepped forward. Her name tag read Linda, and she seemed distracted, shuffling papers while answering questions from other passengers. Marcus gave her a polite smile and handed over his boarding pass along with his frequent flyer card. "I'd like to check if there's availability for an upgrade to first class," he said calmly, his voice warm but firm. Linda took the documents without much acknowledgement, typing something into her computer. For a moment, everything seemed normal. But then her expression shifted ever so slightly, just a flicker of hesitation in her eyes, and Marcus noticed it immediately. After a few seconds, which felt longer than they should have, Linda shook her head. "I'm sorry, sir," she replied, almost too quickly. "There are no available seats in first class." She slid his boarding pass back across the counter, avoiding eye contact. Her tone wasn't rude, but it lacked warmth, as though she wanted to end the conversation as swiftly as possible. Marcus raised an eyebrow, surprised by the abruptness of her response. He'd been told the same thing before, of course, but this time it felt different. Something about the way she dismissed his request left a sour taste in his mouth. Still, he nodded politely, masking his confusion behind a practiced smile. "Thank you," he said, taking his boarding pass and stepping aside. As he walked away, Marcus couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. The flight wasn't fully booked. He could see that from the number of empty rows displayed on the monitor nearby. And yet, here he was, being denied an upgrade despite having enough miles to qualify. Was it simply bad luck? Or was there something else at play? He pushed the thought aside for now, reminding himself not to jump to conclusions. After all, these kinds of mix-ups happened occasionally. But deep down, Marcus knew better. Over the years, he'd learned to recognize subtle signs of bias. The slight pause when someone realized his name sounded different, the skeptical looks when he introduced himself as an Admiral, the assumptions people made based on his appearance rather than his credentials. Today felt like another one of those moments. Boarding began shortly afterward, and Marcus made his way toward the economy section, finding his assigned seat near the back of the plane. As he settled in, adjusting his carry-on bag above him, he caught snippets of conversations around him. A businessman in a sharp suit complained loudly about legroom, while a mother struggled to calm her restless toddler. The hum of chatter filled the cabin, blending with the occasional clink of luggage being stowed overhead. Despite the noise, Marcus found himself replaced. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Marcus adjusted his seatbelt and leaned back, trying to make himself comfortable in a cramped economy class space. The man seated next to him, a sharply dressed businessman with a sleek laptop bag at his feet, glanced over and gave a polite nod. "Long flight ahead," the man said casually, attempting to break the ice. Marcus returned the nod with a small smile. "Sure is," he replied, keeping his tone light. He wasn't much for small talk, especially on flights, but something about the man's demeanor made him willing to engage, just a little. The conversation started innocently enough. The businessman introduced himself as Greg, explaining that he was returning from a conference in Europe. He asked Marcus where he worked, clearly expecting some mundane answer. When Marcus mentioned the Navy, Greg's eyebrows shot up in mild surprise. "Oh, so you're in the military?" Greg asked, leaning slightly closer. His tone shifted from casual curiosity to something tinged with skepticism. "What do you do there? Are you enlisted?" Marcus hesitated for only a fraction of a second before responding. "No, I'm an officer," he said simply, leaving it at that. He didn't feel the need to elaborate or throw around titles. Not here, not now. But Greg seemed unsatisfied with the vague response. "An officer, huh?" Greg pressed, his voice carrying just a hint of condescension. "Must be tough working your way up. How long have you been in the Navy?" Marcus kept his expression neutral, though inwardly he bristled at the assumption behind the question. Greg had already decided who Marcus was, a low-ranking sailor, probably fresh out of training, struggling to climb the ranks. It wasn't outright hostility, but the dismissive undertone was unmistakable. "I've been serving for over 30 years, Marcus replied evenly, meeting Greg's gaze without flinching. There was no arrogance in his tone, just quiet confidence. Still, Greg chuckled lightly, shaking his head as though amused by the idea. 30 years. Wow, that's dedication, he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. You must really love what you do. Marcus nodded politely, choosing not to correct Greg further. Instead, he let the man continue talking, rambling on about his own job, something high-powered in finance, and how stressful it was to manage teams and close deals. Greg spoke with an air of self-importance, clearly proud of his accomplishments. Marcus listened silently, occasionally nodding or offering a brief comment, all while reflecting on the stark contrast between them. Greg lived in a world where status was measured by wealth and power, displayed through tailored suits and flashy gadgets. Marcus, on the other hand, had spent decades earning respect through hard work, sacrifice, and leadership under pressure. Yet here they were, side by side, and Greg couldn't see past appearances to recognize the depth of experience sitting right next to him. At one point, Greg paused mid-sentence, studying Marcus more closely. "So, what rank are you exactly?" he asked, his curiosity finally getting the better of him. There was still a note of doubt in his voice, as if he couldn't quite believe this unassuming man could hold any significant position. Marcus considered answering truthfully but decided against it. Something about Greg's attitude told him it wouldn't matter anyway. The man wasn't ready to hear it. So instead, he offered a cryptic smile. "Let's just say I've seen my share of challenges," he said softly, turning his attention to the window as the plane began its ascent. Outside, clouds stretched endlessly across the horizon, soft and serene. Inside, however, tension simmered beneath the surface. Marcus knew the conversation wasn't over, not entirely. But for now, he chose silence, letting Greg's assumptions hang in the air like an unspoken challenge. About an hour into the flight, just as Greg had finally settled into his seat to catch up on emails, the plane hit turbulence. At first, it was mild, a gentle rocking that barely caused a stir among passengers. But within moments, the bumps grew sharper, jolting everyone in their seats. Drinks spilled, children cried out, and overhead bins rattled loudly. The once calm atmosphere turned chaotic as fear rippled through the cabin. Marcus sat perfectly still, gripping the armrests with steady hands. Years of training kicked in, keeping him calm even as the plane shook violently. He knew turbulence wasn't dangerous, at least not usually. But panic could spread quickly in situations like this. Around him, passengers clutched each other or muttered prayers under their breath. A woman 2 rows ahead screamed when her tray table flipped over, scattering snacks onto the floor. Suddenly, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We're experiencing some unexpected turbulence, but we'll do our best to navigate through it safely." Despite the reassurance, the tension in the air only thickened. Then came another announcement, one that sent a wave of alarm coursing through the cabin. "If there is anyone aboard with medical training, please identify yourself to a member of the crew." A flight attendant hurried down the aisle, scanning faces anxiously. Marcus watched as she stopped near the front of the plane, speaking quietly to a passenger who hesitated before shaking his head. "No doctor? No nurse?" The attendant moved further back, her expression growing more desperate by the second. Without hesitation, Marcus unbuckled his seatbelt and raised his hand slightly, catching her attention. "I can help," he said firmly, standing up despite the jerking motion of the aircraft. His voice carried authority, cutting through the chaos like a knife. The flight attendant turned to him, relief washing over her face. "Thank you, sir," she said quickly. "We have a passenger who's having trouble breathing. Follow me." Greg, who had been gripping his armrests tightly, looked up in surprise. "Wait, you?" he blurted out, his tone incredulous. "You're helping?" Marcus ignored him, focusing instead on following the attendant toward the commotion at the front of the plane. As they reached the distressed passenger, a middle-aged man clutching his chest and gasping for air, Marcus immediately took charge. Drawing on years of emergency response training from his time in the Navy, he instructed the flight attendants to retrieve oxygen masks and clear the area around the man. "Stay calm," Marcus told the struggling passenger, kneeling beside him. His voice was steady, reassuring. "You're going to be okay. Just focus on breathing slowly." With practiced efficiency, he guided the man through deep breaths while monitoring his condition closely. The turbulence continued to rock the plane, but Marcus remained unfazed, his movements deliberate and precise. Passengers nearby craned their necks to watch, whispering among themselves. Who was this man? Why did he seem so confident in such a high-pressure situation? Some recognized the signs of leadership, his commanding presence, his ability to take control without hesitation. Others simply marveled at how calm he appeared amidst the chaos. After several tense minutes, the man began to stabilize. His breathing slowed, and color returned to his face. The flight attendants thanked Marcus profusely, visibly shaken but grateful for his intervention. As Marcus made his way back to his seat, whispers erupted throughout the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances, curiosity piqued by the unassuming traveler who had stepped up when no one else could. Greg stared at Marcus as he sat back down, his earlier skepticism replaced by wide-eyed disbelief. What exactly do you do in the Navy again?" he asked, his voice quieter now, tinged with awe. Marcus met his gaze evenly, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "Let's just say I've handled worse than this," he replied cryptically, leaving Greg and everyone else to wonder what kind of man they were truly sitting next to. As the turbulence subsided and the plane steadied, a palpable sense of relief washed over the cabin. Passengers loosened their white-knuckled grips on armrests, some exhaling deeply while others exchanged nervous smiles. The crisis had passed, but the ripple effects of what had just happened lingered in the air, especially around Marcus Thompson. Word spread quickly about the man who had stepped forward to help during the chaos. While most passengers were grateful for his calm intervention, not everyone was convinced of his credentials. Whispers began to circulate, growing louder as curiosity turned into skepticism. How could this unassuming black man, who looked like any other traveler, possess the kind of expertise needed to handle such a high-pressure situation? Was he really part of the Navy, as he claimed? Greg, seated beside Marcus, seemed particularly conflicted. Earlier, he'd dismissed Marcus as someone low-ranking, perhaps even exaggerating his role in the military. But now, after witnessing Marcus take charge with precision and authority, doubt gnawed at him. Still, pride, and maybe a hint of defensiveness, kept him from accepting it outright. "I mean, come on," Greg muttered under his breath to another passenger seated across the aisle. "Do you really think he's that important? Maybe he just got lucky." His comment didn't go unnoticed. A middle-aged woman nearby shot him a sharp look. "You saw how he handled things back there," she said pointedly. "That wasn't luck. That was skill. And if he says he's in the Navy, I believe him." The debate continued quietly among the passengers, opinions divided. Some leaned toward admiration, impressed by Marcus's composure and apparent training. Others clung to disbelief, unable or unwilling to reconcile the image of a decorated officer with the man sitting in economy class wearing jeans and a sweater. Meanwhile, the flight crew approached Marcus once more, this time to personally thank him. One of the attendants handed him a bottle of water and expressed her gratitude. "We're so lucky you were here today," she said sincerely. Her tone carried respect, but also a subtle question, one that hung in the air between them. Why was someone like him traveling in coach? When the pilot came on the intercom shortly afterward, his words amplified the tension. "Folks, we've made it through the rough patch, thanks in large part to one of our passengers, a Navy officer who stepped up when we needed help. Please join me in giving him your appreciation." Applause erupted throughout the cabin, though it was mixed with murmurs of disbelief. "A Navy officer?" One man whispered loudly. "If he's legit, why isn't he flying first class?" Marcus heard the remark clearly but chose not to respond. He remained stoic, staring out the window as the applause died down. Inside, however, frustration simmered. It wasn't the first time he'd faced this kind of scrutiny, nor would it be the last. People wanted proof, something tangible to validate his claims. Yet Marcus knew better than to let their doubts shake him. He'd spent decades earning his place in life, not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. Greg, still wrestling with his own assumptions, finally spoke up again. This time, his voice lacked its earlier condescension. "Look, I'm not saying you didn't do a great job back there," he began cautiously. "But Are you actually an admiral? Like a real one? Marcus turned to face him, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he considered letting the question hang unanswered, allowing Greg to wrestle with his uncertainty. But then he realized something. Sometimes silence isn't enough. Sometimes revealing the truth is the only way to break through stubborn biases. With a quiet sigh, Marcus reached into his bag and pulled out his official Navy ID badge. He held it up briefly, just long enough for Greg and several nearby passengers to see his name, photo, and 4-star insignia. Gasps rippled through the cabin as people craned their necks to get a better look. Greg's jaw dropped. Wait, you're serious? You're really an admiral? Marcus nodded once, slipping the badge back into his bag without ceremony. Yes, he said simply. I am. For the rest of the flight, no one dared question him again. Instead, they watched him with newfound respect, and perhaps a touch of shame for having doubted him in the first place. When the plane finally touched down and taxied to the gate, the atmosphere aboard was electric. Passengers unbuckled their seatbelts with a mix of relief and lingering excitement from the events that had unfolded during the flight. For many, the turbulence had been frightening enough, but what truly stayed with them was Admiral Marcus Thompson's quiet yet commanding presence in the face of chaos. As people began gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark, whispers about the unassuming Navy officer continued to ripple through the cabin. Greg, still seated beside Marcus, seemed frozen in his chair, his earlier skepticism replaced by an awkward mixture of embarrassment and awe. He glanced repeatedly at Marcus as if trying to reconcile the man he mocked earlier with the decorated 4-star admiral who had just revealed himself. Finally, unable to contain his curiosity or guilt any longer, Greg leaned over. So you're really an admiral? He asked again, his voice quieter this time, almost hesitant. It wasn't disbelief anymore. It was reverence tinged with regret. Marcus turned to him, his expression calm but firm. Yes, he replied simply, meeting Greg's gaze without judgment. There was no anger in his tone, only a quiet dignity that somehow made Greg feel even smaller. Greg stammered, fumbling for words. I'm sorry. I didn't realize. I shouldn't have assumed. His voice trailed off, leaving the apology unfinished but hanging heavily between them. Marcus nodded once, accepting the gesture without comment. He knew apologies like this all too well. The kind born out of shock after someone's biases were laid bare. While he appreciated the acknowledgement, he also understood that such moments weren't about him. They were opportunities for others to reflect on their own assumptions and grow. As passengers began filing out of the plane, several stopped near Marcus to express gratitude or admiration. A young mother holding her toddler's hand thanked him profusely for helping during the turbulence. An elderly man tipped his hat respectfully, calling him a true hero. Even the flight attendants paused to shake his hand one last time before heading off to complete their post-flight duties. But not everyone approached him directly. Some passengers whispered among themselves, marveling at how wrong they'd been about him. Others looked away, clearly uncomfortable with the realization that they'd judged him based solely on appearances. Still, there was a collective shift in energy, something intangible but undeniable, as people processed what they'd witnessed. At baggage claim, the ripple effect of Marcus's revelation grew wider. The gate agent who had denied him first class earlier spotted him standing patiently by the carousel. Her eyes widened in recognition as she hurried over, her face flushed with mortification. Admiral Thompson, she exclaimed, her voice trembling slightly. I am so sorry about earlier. I had no idea. Marcus raised a hand gently, cutting her off mid-sentence. It's all right, he said kindly, though his tone carried a note of finality. Mistakes happen. What matters is learning from them. The agent nodded fervently, promising to ensure nothing like this would happen again. Whether out of genuine remorse or fear of backlash, it was clear the encounter had left a deep impression on her. By the time Marcus retrieved his luggage and stepped outside the terminal, News of the incident had already begun spreading beyond the confines of the airplane. Other travelers who had overheard snippets of the story shared it enthusiastically, with friends and family waiting to pick them up. Social media buzzed with speculation, fueled by second-hand accounts of the Black Admiral, who had stunned everyone on board. For Marcus, however, the attention wasn't what mattered most. As he climbed into a cab headed home, he reflected on the day's events, not with bitterness, but with hope. Each moment of bias he encountered reminded him why representation mattered. By simply being himself, he had challenged stereotypes and opened minds. And while one day wouldn't change the world, every step forward counted. Little did he know, the impact of his actions would soon reach far beyond the walls of that airplane cabin. The story of Admiral Marcus Thompson didn't stay confined to the passengers on that flight for long. Within hours, word had spread far beyond the airplane cabin. A journalist seated in business class, a sharp-eyed woman who had overheard the murmurs and seen Marcus's ID badge, decided to dig deeper. She approached him after landing, introducing herself and asking if he'd be open to sharing his experience. At first, Marcus hesitated. He wasn't one to seek the spotlight, and he preferred letting his actions speak for themselves. But something about her sincerity struck a chord. "I'm not looking for fame," Marcus told her plainly. "But if telling my story can help people see past their assumptions, then maybe it's worth it." With his permission, the journalist wrote an article detailing the events of the flight, the turbulence, the medical emergency, and the shocking revelation of his rank. The piece was published online late that evening, accompanied by photos of Marcus, taken with his consent, and quotes from passengers who had witnessed everything firsthand. By morning, the story had gone viral. Social media exploded with reactions. Some praised Marcus as a hero, highlighting his calm leadership during the crisis. Others expressed outrage at the way he'd been treated, denied an upgrade despite his credentials, underestimated because of his appearance, and doubted even after stepping up to save a fellow passenger. Debates erupted across platforms, with users dissecting systemic biases in industries like aviation and beyond. The airline involved quickly issued a public apology, acknowledging the oversight and pledging to address implicit bias within its operations. They offered Marcus lifelong VIP status as restitution, but he declined politely. Instead, he urged them to focus on tangible changes: better training for staff, clearer policies against discrimination, and initiatives to promote diversity and inclusion at every level. To his surprise, they listened. In the days that followed, invitations poured in from news outlets, talk shows, and advocacy groups eager to hear Marcus' perspective. Though initially reluctant, he accepted a few select opportunities to speak publicly, not to glorify himself, but to shed light on broader issues. On one popular morning show, he sat down with the host and shared his thoughts candidly. "This isn't just about me," Marcus said, leaning forward slightly. "It's about all the people who face similar situations every day. People whose qualifications are questioned, whose identities are dismissed, simply because they don't fit someone else's idea of what success looks like. We have work to do, as individuals, as organizations, and as a society." His words resonated deeply, sparking conversations in workplaces, schools, and homes around the country. People began examining their own biases more critically, questioning why they made snap judgments based on appearances or stereotypes. For many, Marcus's story became a catalyst for change, a reminder that respect and recognition should never depend on outward markers of status. Meanwhile, Greg, the businessman who had once mocked Marcus, reached out privately to apologize again. This time, his message was heartfelt and reflective. "I owe you more than an apology," Greg wrote in an email. "You've made me rethink how I view people, and I promise to do better moving forward." Marcus appreciated the gesture, responding with a simple note: "Awareness is the first step toward progress." Despite the whirlwind of attention, Marcus remained grounded. He returned to his routine, focusing on his family and his duties in the Navy. Yet he couldn't ignore the impact his story had created. Strangers stopped him on the street to thank him for inspiring them. Young black men and women pursuing careers in fields dominated by prejudice reached out to share how his example gave them hope. Even within the military, colleagues expressed pride in seeing one of their own stand as a symbol of resilience and dignity. For Marcus, this was the most meaningful outcome, a ripple effect of courage and understanding spreading far beyond anything he could have imagined. Months passed, but the legacy of Admiral Marcus Thompson's story continued to grow. It wasn't just a fleeting moment that captured headlines. It became a touchstone for conversations about race, respect, and representation in everyday life. People from all walks of life found inspiration in his quiet strength and unwavering grace under pressure. For Marcus, however, the real reward wasn't fame or recognition. It was knowing that his actions had sparked meaningful change. One evening, as he sat on the porch of his home overlooking a quiet suburban street, Marcus reflected on how much had shifted since that fateful flight. The airline had implemented new training programs focused on combating bias, ensuring employees recognized the value of every passenger regardless of appearance. Schools began incorporating his story into lessons about leadership and equality, teaching students the importance of looking beyond surface-level judgments. Even within the military, discussions around diversity and inclusion gained renewed momentum, with leaders citing Marcus's example as proof that true strength lies in character, not assumptions. But perhaps the most profound impact came from the personal stories shared with him. Letters arrived daily, some typed neatly, others handwritten with care, from people who felt seen because of what Marcus had done. A young black cadet wrote to say he no longer doubted whether he belonged in a predominantly white academy after hearing Marcus's story. A retired teacher described how she used his experience to challenge her grandchildren's preconceived notions about authority and identity. Each message reinforced the idea that small moments of courage could ripple outward, touching lives in ways Marcus never anticipated. Despite the widespread attention, Marcus remained steadfastly humble. When friends teased him about becoming internet famous, he chuckled and brushed it off. "I'm just doing my job," he'd say with a shrug. Yet those closest to him knew better. His wife often reminded him that being a role model wasn't something he chose. It was something he embodied naturally, simply by living authentically. As time went on, Marcus embraced opportunities to speak at conferences and community events, using his platform to advocate for systemic change. He didn't mince words when addressing audiences. Bias isn't always loud or obvious, he'd explain. Sometimes it's subtle. A glance, a tone, a decision made without thought. But its effects are real, and we must confront it head-on if we want to build a fairer world. His speeches weren't fiery or overly dramatic. They were calm, measured, and deeply human. That authenticity resonated with listeners, leaving them inspired to examine their own behaviors and make improvements where needed. After one particularly moving talk, a teenage girl approached him with tears in her eyes. "You've shown me I don't have to shrink myself to fit into spaces where I belong," she said softly. Marcus knelt down to meet her gaze, offering a reassuring smile. "Never let anyone tell you otherwise," he replied. By the end of the year, Marcus's story had transcended borders, inspiring similar discussions worldwide. In Europe, activists referenced his experience while advocating for anti-discrimination policies in travel industries. In Africa, educators highlighted his journey during workshops aimed at empowering marginalized youth. Everywhere, people drew strength from his refusal to be defined by stereotypes. For Marcus, the journey wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about staying true to himself despite the challenges. And through it all, he proved that sometimes the simplest acts of integrity can leave the deepest impressions. As he stood on stage at a gala honoring trailblazers in civil rights, accepting an award for his contributions, Marcus offered a final thought. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it certainly doesn't come from waiting for someone else to lead the way. It starts with each of us choosing to see the humanity in others, even when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable. If my story helps even one person take that step, then it's been worth every moment. And with that, Admiral Marcus Thompson stepped back into the shadows, content to let his legacy speak for itself.